The Pursuit of Spices by Cynthia Clampett. The world demands spices. Spices have been a vital part of international commerce for more than 4,000 years. Most of the world's favorite spices originated in southern India, Sri Lanka, and the Moluccas, or Spice Islands of Indonesia. They were being traded as far away as the Middle East by 2600 BC. Flavoring foods was not the only thing for which spices were being used. The Egyptians used cinnamon and cassia for embalming mummies, while Israelites used them to make fragrant oil for religious ceremonies. Cassia is a tree with bark that tastes like cinnamon, though it is stronger. Almost everyone used spices as medicine. Today, we are learning that many spices do have medicinal uses. Black pepper, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, and cassia were the most important spices of early commerce. These spices were carried throughout Asia and the Arabian Peninsula. They finally reached the Mediterranean region by the 400s BC. The Romans consumed spices in enormous quantities. Ancient Rome had an entire market just for black pepper. Ginger sold so well that the tax collected on ginger sales provided a major portion of the income needed to support the Roman government. While all the spices were popular and heavily traded, pepper was definitely the king of spices. When Alaric the Visigoth held Rome for ransom in AD 408, his demands included 3,000 pounds of black pepper. By the Middle Ages, a serf in France could buy freedom for 1 pound of black pepper. Wealth was often spoken of in terms of how much pepper a person had. The Arabs controlled the spice trade for hundreds of years. They spread stories that spices were guarded by winged beasts and poisonous snakes to try to keep away competition. The Romans, however, did not believe the tales, and around AD 40 they found a way to use the monsoon winds to sail to India. As soon as the Romans could trade directly with India, their consumption of spices increased dramatically. When Rome's power declined, North Africa's Arab traders controlled the spice trade again. Merchants from Venice, who bought spices from the Arab traders, enjoyed a monopoly on the spices coming through Alexandria during most of the Middle Ages. With Europe consuming an average of 6.6 million pounds of pepper annually, Venice became quite wealthy enough, in fact, to create jealousy and competition. Muslim influence spreads. From the time of Muhammad, Muslims began spreading their religion and culture. Islam was spread through trade, which is how it reached India and Indonesia, and through war, which is how it reached Mediterranean lands. During the late 600s, Arabs spread across North Africa, conquering the outposts of the Byzantine Empire. In the spring of 711, Muslims from North Africa invaded Spain. By 714, most of Spain and Portugal were under Muslim control. The Muslims who had invaded Spain and Portugal were called Moors. The Muslim culture was in some ways better than the culture of the Visigoths, who had controlled much of Spain before the Moors arrived. Some people benefited by the Moorish presence. Serfs who converted to Islam could gain their freedom. Taxes were often lower under the Moors than under the Visigoths. In addition, Muslim culture brought Europeans into contact with sciences and arts that Muslim scholars had collected from ancient Greece and India, or discovered themselves, such as architecture, map-making, mathematics, and astronomy. Another Muslim group, the Ottoman Turks, threatened the Byzantine Empire throughout the 1200s and 1300s. The Turks conquered Asia Minor, and then entered Europe in the mid-1300s. They moved through the Balkan countries and captured Macedonia. In 1422, the Ottoman Turks set out to conquer Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This attempt failed, but another attempt in 1453 was successful. The fall of Constantinople sent a shockwave through Europe. Not only was this city the capital of a powerful empire, it was also the center for trade with Asia. The spice trade was cut off. In 1492, after 700 years, Spain finally succeeded in driving out the Moors. After centuries of fighting, the Spanish government could focus its attention and spend its money on something besides war. Finding a new way to India seemed like a good idea. The first country that reached India would become quite rich. The problem of distance. Europeans knew the earth was round long before Columbus's time. In fact, the ancient Greeks calculated the planet's circumference, or the distance around a circle. What kept Europeans from sailing west was that they knew that the earth was 25,000 miles around at the equator. That meant Asia was many thousands of miles west of Europe. Ships were small, and it was impossible to carry food and water to last for more than a few months. There had to be places to stop for supplies. People felt certain that there was no land between Europe and Asia, so there would be nowhere to stop. The trip seemed unlikely. Another problem was that it was difficult to determine a ship's position when it sailed too far from Europe. Stars could be used to determine position, but if a ship sailed too far south, the stars were different. People knew about latitude, but no one had been able to calculate longitude accurately. As a result, it was impossible to estimate how far east or west a ship was when it was sailing out of sight of land. The only instruments available were the magnetic compass to show direction and the astrolabe, an ancient instrument that used the stars to help determine position. Maps were also important to navigation, the science of charting a ship's course and position. Maps, however, helped only while you were near land. What would finally make Europeans willing to attempt sailing to Asia? India is closer than you think. Basque fishermen who traveled the North Atlantic in search of codfish sometimes told tales of seeing land. Few people believed these tales, but one man took them seriously. Christopher Columbus was certain these tales were true, and he was certain that the land was Asia. Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy in 1451, though the exact date of his birth is uncertain. He learned sailing and navigation in the Portuguese merchant marine, and while working for a number of trading companies. By 1485, he had sailed as far north as Iceland and as far south as West Africa, improving his skills and learning the Atlantic wind systems, knowledge that would help him later. As his dream of reaching Asia grew, Columbus asked the King of Portugal for support, but the king refused to help him. By 1486, Columbus had moved to Spain, where he talked to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella about his project. Influenced by the writings of Marco Polo, Columbus was sure that Asia was close enough to reach by sailing west. In figuring out the distance he would have to sail, he also made an error that would place Asia thousands of miles closer to Europe. Columbus's project was rejected twice. Columbus was at the siege of Granada, the last Moorish territory in Spain, when it surrendered in January 1492. On his way home, he received a message from the king and queen. Pleased with the recent victory, they were now prepared to help with Columbus's planned journey. Columbus was given the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea. A court official helped him raise money for the trip, even though Columbus also used his own savings for the venture. On August 3, 1492, the hopeful explorer departed from Spain. Columbus showed his navigational skill right from the start. Rather than sailing straight west, he sailed south to Africa, where he could take advantage of winds that blew in a westward direction. Even with good winds, it took 2 months to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and his crew became fearful. On October 12, 1492, land was finally sighted. They thought they had reached the East Indies. Columbus and his crew sailed among the islands, giving them Spanish names while looking for China and Japan. Though he could not find Asia's great cities, Columbus did find gold in Haiti, which he named Hispaniola. With the help of the Taino inhabitants of the island, he built a fort and left part of his crew behind. Then, with gold, parrots, spices, new foods, and a few captives, he sailed back to Spain. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were pleased with what Columbus brought them, but they still wanted him to locate India. Columbus made 3 more voyages, exploring farther each time. However, although he was a brilliant navigator, he was a terrible governor. Settlements he tried to establish failed. He was too focused on his goals. As a result, he was not a good judge of people, and often mishandled situations, which caused him to make many enemies. He never became as famous as he had hoped, and he died still believing he had reached Asia. However, many people recognized the importance of what he had done. He had opened a path across the sea. Soon, other ships were sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. Can Europeans sail east? It was the Romans who had discovered that if you could get to the east side of Africa, you could reach India. For centuries, this had been accomplished by crossing Egypt to get to the Red Sea, building ships, and then sailing across the Indian Ocean. When the Muslims' conquest of the region closed this land route, Europeans began to wonder if there was another way to reach Africa's eastern side. In 1488, Portuguese navigator and explorer Bartolomeu Diaz made a discovery that answered this question. He had been sent south to discover if it was possible to sail around Africa. Diaz spent more than a year following the African coast. In February 1488, he sailed past the end of Africa, turned east, and discovered that his path was no longer blocked by land. Diaz had discovered that you could sail around Africa, so there was a sea route to the Spice Lands. As he sailed home, Diaz saw a high rocky point of land that marked the southern limit of Africa. He named it the Cape of Good Hope because it offered the hope that he would reach India one day. The King of Portugal did not act on this discovery for another 9 years. When he did act, he did not ask Diaz to sail to India. That honor went instead to Vasco da Gama, the son of a Portuguese nobleman. Little is known of da Gama's early life except that he was born around 1460 and studied mathematics and navigation. When the King of Portugal decided in 1495 that it was time to send a fleet to India, he chose Estevão da Gama, Vasco da Gama's father, to lead the expedition. When Estevão died, his son took his place. Vasco da Gama left Portugal on July 8, 1497. Sailing south, da Gama did not reach the Cape of Good Hope until November 22nd. By March of the following year, he had reached Mozambique. There, he offended the Sultan by offering him trinkets instead of the fine items the Sultan was expecting. By April 1498, da Gama's expedition reached Kenya. There, da Gama found a sailor who knew the way to India. It took 23 days to cross the Indian Ocean. On May 20th, da Gama reached Calicut, one of the great trading ports of southern India. Da Gama's voyage home was difficult, but he returned to Portugal in September 1499. The King of Portugal immediately sent out a fleet of 13 ships under the command of Pedro Alvarez Cabral. Cabral reached India, but the people he left behind there were killed. In 1502, da Gama was given command of the fleet that was sent to get revenge. The Portuguese had better weapons than the Indians and Arabs they faced, and soon Portugal had taken possession of most of southern India's spice trade ports. With control of the world spice trade, Portugal was suddenly a world power. Da Gama returned to Portugal, but in 1524 the king named him viceroy, or governor of India. He died in India in 1538. East and west of the line. Portugal and Spain had been rivals for a long time. After Columbus's first voyage, the two countries agreed to divide the world. An imaginary line, called the Line of Demarcation, was drawn from north to south, running through Greenland and Brazil. According to the agreement, everything west of the line was controlled by Spain. Everything east of the line was controlled by Portugal. Portugal began to take control of much of the African coast and southern India. By 1512, the Portuguese had even reached the Moluccas, the Spice Islands of Indonesia. The Moluccas were so far west, however, that the King of Spain wondered if they might be closer to the western lands on the other side of the world that were under his control. Ferdinand Magellan offered to find out the answer. Magellan was born in Portugal in 1480. He sailed for many years with the Portuguese navy, taking part in battles in Africa and India. In 1513 he was sent to Morocco to battle the Moors. Magellan received a wound that left him with a limp for the rest of his life. When he later asked the king for a small raise in pay, the king refused and said that Magellan should consider working for someone else. Magellan gave up his Portuguese citizenship and offered his services to the King of Spain. Magellan suggested that the Moluccas could be reached by sailing west, rather than around Africa. The king approved of the plan, and on September 20th, 1519, Magellan left Spain in command of 5 ships. Even though Magellan encountered storms as he crossed the Atlantic, he reached Rio de Janeiro safely by December 13th. He hoped to find a passage through South America, so he explored inlets and bays as he sailed south. Another kind of storm lay ahead. Some of the Spanish captains resented having a Portuguese commander, and in March 1520 there was a serious mutiny. However, Magellan was able to stop the mutiny. Continuing south, Magellan found a strait, a narrow channel that connects 2 bodies of water, on October 21st. This was the passage Magellan had hoped to find, and so he sailed through to the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific crossing was calm but very long. The ship's crews were sick and starving by the time they reached Guam in March 1521. They stayed long enough to regain their health, and then loaded the ships with coconuts and sailed on. Magellan sailed next to the islands later known as the Philippines. He made an alliance with the people of one island, but on April 27th, natives on a different island killed Magellan. From the Philippines, Magellan's 2 surviving ships continued sailing east to the Moluccas, but only one reached Spain in 1522. This was the first circumnavigation of the world. Though Magellan did not return from the voyage, the success was still considered his. It had been his plan, and he was the commander who had guided the expedition around South America and across the Pacific Ocean. The passage he had discovered was named the Strait of Magellan in his honor.